At 8:43 a.m. on July 2, 1937, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca received its final transmission from aircraft CAC. We are on the line 157 to 337. Then silence. America's most famous aviator and her navigator had just vanished into the largest search grid the world had ever seen. Amelia Earhart wasn't supposed to be a mystery. She was supposed to be a triumph. The 39-year-old aviator had departed Miami on June 1, 1937, attempting to become the first woman to circumnavigate the globe at the equator. For 22,000 miles, everything had gone according to plan. Her twin-engine Lockheed Electra had hopscotched across South America, Africa, India, and Southeast Asia without major incident. By the time she reached New Guinea, on June 29, only 7,000 miles remained. One more leg. One tiny speck of coral in the Pacific Ocean called Howland Island. What happened next would become America's most enduring aviation mystery. Not because the plane disappeared. Planes disappeared regularly in 1937. But because of what came after. The radio signals. The search operation that mobilized an aircraft carrier and multiple warships. The international jurisdictional maze that determined who could search where, and why massive areas of ocean remained untouched. The theories that would multiply for nearly 90 years, each claiming to explain those final cryptic coordinates. Here's what we know for certain. Earhart and navigator Fred Noonan took off from at 10 a.m. local time on July 2, heading for Howland Island, a target barely 6,500 feet long and 1,600 feet wide, rising just 6 feet above sea level. The flight distance, 2,556 miles over open ocean. No landmarks. No margin for error. The Itasca waited at Howland with radio operators ready to guide them in. 4 hours. The ship received intermittent transmissions as Earhart drew closer. Her voice grew stronger. She reported being low on fuel. She couldn't hear the Itasca's replies. At 7:42 a.m., her transmission was nearly shouting level. "We must be on you but cannot see you." Then came that final message. "We are on the line 157 to 337. In navigation terms, a line of position, a bearing drawn on a map where the aircraft believed itself to be. Line 157 to 337 ran northwest to southeast, passing directly through Howland Island. It also intersected dozens of other islands. The transmission was strong, suggesting Earhart was close. But close to what? The Itasca tried to respond. Radio operators sent bearings, smoke signals, everything they had. Nothing came back. By noon, it was clear something had gone catastrophically wrong. The U.S. Coast Guard launched what would become, at that time, the most extensive air-sea search in history. But here's where the international angle gets complicated, and where American listeners need to understand how different maritime law worked in 1937 versus today. The search grid covered an area roughly 250,000 square miles. In American waters, the Coast Guard would have had unilateral authority. But Howland Island sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by international waters and territories controlled by foreign powers. To the west lay the Japanese Mandate, a chain of Pacific islands Japan had seized from Germany after World War I and immediately closed to American vessels. The U.S. Navy knew those islands were closer to Earhart's last known position than Howland. They also knew that searching there could trigger an international incident with Japan, whose military already considered America an enemy. So the search happened everywhere except where it maybe should have happened first. Why? Because in 1937, there was no unified international maritime search protocol. No agreements about who had authority where. Unlike today's coordinated Coast Guard operations that cross borders with pre-established treaties, the 1937 search operated in a geopolitical minefield where one wrong move could start a war. By July 19, 17 days after Earhart disappeared, the official search ended. No wreckage. No bodies. No answers. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were declared lost at sea. But people kept hearing radio signals. And that's where this case stops being a simple crash story and becomes something far stranger. What did 157 to 337 really mean? Why did post-loss radio transmissions allegedly continue for days? And why, nearly 90 years later, do we still have three completely different theories about where that Lockheed Electra ended up? The answer lies in understanding not just what happened in the air, but what happened on the ground, in radio rooms, government offices, and international waters where jurisdiction ended and chaos began. The clock was already running out before Earhart even took off. What nobody aboard the Itasca knew was that the pilot in that Lockheed didn't actually know how to use half her radio equipment. Before Amelia Earhart became a mystery, she made a critical mistake in Miami. She had her trailing wire antenna removed. Most Americans don't realize how primitive 1937 aviation radio actually was. There was no GPS, no satellite communication, no automatic distress beacons. Long-distance navigation relied on radio direction finding, essentially pointing an antenna at a radio signal and using the angle to calculate your position. For this to work over thousands of miles of ocean, you needed a specific type of antenna, a weighted wire that trailed behind the aircraft, sometimes 250 feet long, that could pick up low-frequency signals. Earhart's Lockheed Electra had been equipped with this system. Before departing, she decided it was too cumbersome. She had it completely removed, along with associated equipment. In American terms, this would be like a deep-sea fisherman removing his marine radio before sailing into the Atlantic because he didn't want to deal with the wiring. It wasn't just risky, it was eliminating the primary safety net. Here's the international angle American listeners need to understand. In 1937, there were no standardized aviation communication protocols. Different countries used different frequencies, different radio systems, different languages for distress calls. What worked flying over the United States didn't necessarily work over the Pacific, where you might encounter Australian, British, Dutch, or Japanese radio operators, each using their own systems. Earhart's decision to simplify her radio setup essentially meant she was flying with equipment designed for short-range communication over a 2,500-mile oceanic void. The consequences showed up immediately. As Earhart flew from La toward Howland, the Itasca transmitted constantly on multiple frequencies, trying to establish two-way contact. They needed to send her directional bearings, the navigational equivalent of someone on the ground telling you, "Turn left, you're too far south." But Earhart couldn't receive on the frequencies the Itasca was using. Her transmissions came through loud and clear. The Itasca's responses? Silence. The radio log from that morning reads like a nightmare. At 2:45 a.m. Howland time, Earhart transmitted, "Cloudy and overcast." The Itasca responded on 3,105 kilocycles. No acknowledgement from the plane. At 6:14 a.m., Earhart radioed she wanted bearings on 3,105 kilocycles on the hour. The Itasca transmitted exactly that. Earhart never confirmed receiving them. At 7:42 a.m., her voice came through at maximum strength. "We must be on you but cannot see you." She was shouting into a one-way conversation, flying blind in more ways than one. This is where the investigation pattern diverges sharply from American standards. In the United States, the National Transportation Safety Board would have immediately impounded all radio equipment, interviewed every technician who touched that plane, and reconstructed the exact communication timeline. In 1937, with the incident occurring in international waters during an informal private flight, no such investigation happened. The Coast Guard compiled a radio log. The Navy wrote a report. But there was no independent safety board, no formal inquiry into why the radio system failed so catastrophically. By 8 a.m., Earhart was circling. She transmitted that she was running north and south, but couldn't get a minimum reading for a bearing. Translation: she was trying to use her direction finder to locate the Itasca, but the signal was too weak or her equipment wasn't working properly. The Itasca could hear her perfectly. Her signal was at 5 to 5, maximum strength. She was close. Maybe within 50 miles. But in the vast emptiness of the Pacific, 50 miles might as well be 5,000. At 8:43 a.m. came the final transmission. "We are on the line 157 to 337. Then nothing. The Itasca continued broadcasting for hours. They sent their call sign, NRUI. They transmitted voice. They sent continuous signals on every frequency Earhart might be monitoring. The ocean swallowed it all. Here's what American investigators would have wanted to know immediately. Was the radio failure mechanical or operational? Did Earhart know how to properly tune her frequencies? Had she practiced radio direction finding before the flight? The answers, pieced together later, were damning. John Ray, the Eastern Airlines technician who had serviced Earhart's radio in Miami, confirmed the system worked perfectly, when used correctly. The problem wasn't the equipment. It was the operator. Unlike modern American pilot certification, which requires extensive radio communication training and regular proficiency checks, 1937 aviation licensing was far more informal. Earhart was a brilliant pilot but, by multiple accounts, unfamiliar with radio technology. She had relied on navigator Fred Noonan for most of the technical aspects of the journey. But direction finding during the approach to Howland? That required constant two-way radio communication, something Earhart's modified system simply couldn't maintain. The window closed fast. By 10 a.m., the Electra's fuel would have been exhausted based on calculations. Wherever that plane was at 8:43 a.m., it wasn't flying 2 hours later. The Itasca began steaming in expanding circles, scanning the horizon. Personnel reported seeing nothing. No oil slicks, no debris, no distress flares. But then the reports started coming in. Reports that, if true, meant Earhart and Noonan were still alive. And still transmitting. What happened in the first 72 hours after Earhart's disappearance would create a cascade of confusion that haunts this case to the present day. Because people heard things. Or thought they did. And in 1937, there was no centralized system to verify what was real and what was radio interference from halfway around the world. On July 3, 1937, one day after Earhart disappeared, radio operators across the Pacific began logging signals they believed came from CAC, Earhart's call sign. A woman in Florida heard a faint voice saying, "New York, New York." A naval station in Hawaii picked up a carrier wave, a radio signal with no voice, on frequencies Earhart had used. Operators in Los Angeles reported hearing distress calls. Between July 2 and July 13, at least 57 different radio signals were reported as potentially coming from Earhart's Lockheed Electra. Some were dismissed immediately as hoaxes or interference. Others were taken seriously enough that the U.S. Navy altered search patterns based on them. Here's where American listeners need to understand something about 1930s radio technology that's completely foreign to modern communication. Radio waves at certain frequencies could bounce off the ionosphere and travel thousands of miles, appearing to come from one location when they actually originated somewhere completely different. There was no digital verification, no way to confirm a signal's origin through GPS or satellite triangulation. A radio operator in San Francisco hearing a distressed female voice had no definitive way to prove it was Earhart versus someone else on the same frequency halfway around the world. In modern America, the FCC and Coast Guard would immediately implement signal triangulation using multiple receiving stations to pinpoint transmission origin. In 1937, especially across the vast Pacific, this technology existed only in rudimentary form. The Navy tried. They had stations in Hawaii, California, and Samoa all listening simultaneously. But coordinating information across these distances, with telegraph as the fastest communication method, took hours or even days. The most credible phantom signals came from the Itasca itself. On July 3, the cutter's radio operators reported hearing a carrier wave on 3,105 kilocycles, Earhart's frequency. No voice. Just the hum of an activated transmitter. It lasted several minutes, then disappeared. At 10 p.m. that same evening, another brief signal. Then silence again. One theory emerged immediately. Earhart had ditched in shallow water and was transmitting only when the tide was low enough that her radio, powered by the plane's batteries, hadn't been destroyed by seawater. This theory suggested the aircraft was resting on a reef somewhere, partially submerged at high tide but dry enough at low tide to allow brief transmissions. If true, it meant Earhart and Noonan were alive, stranded, and trying to signal for help on an irregular schedule determined by tidal patterns. The U.S. Navy had a problem. They believed some of these signals might be genuine, but they had no idea which ones. And the search grid was already staggeringly large. Captain Wilhelm Friedel, commanding the battleship USS Colorado, made a decision that reveals how differently maritime search operations worked in 1937 versus today. Instead of focusing search efforts on the most probable crash site based on Earhart's last known position and fuel calculations, he split resources to investigate islands where phantom signals might be originating, islands 350 to 400 miles off the original flight path. In modern American Coast Guard protocol, this wouldn't happen. Contemporary search and rescue follows a strict probability matrix. You calculate the most likely drift pattern, fuel exhaustion point, and wreckage zone, then search systematically outward from there. You don't chase unverified signals without strong corroborating evidence. But in 1937, with no established international search protocol and immense public pressure to find America's most famous female pilot, the Navy cast a wider net, arguably too wide. On July 7, the USS Colorado launched 3 aircraft to search the Phoenix Islands, a scattered group of coral atolls 350 miles southeast of Howland. One of those islands, called Gardner Island, now known as Nikumaroro, would later become central to the most persistent theory about Earhart's fate. But in July 1937, the Colorado's pilots saw nothing. They reported Gardner Island uninhabited, the lagoon empty, no signs of recent aircraft activity. This is where the jurisdictional complexity gets critical. Gardner Island was technically British territory, part of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony. The U.S. Navy couldn't just land and conduct a ground search without British permission that would have taken days or weeks to obtain through diplomatic channels. So they did flyovers. Quick aerial surveys that, as we'll see later, might have missed everything. Meanwhile, to the west, a huge swath of ocean remained untouched. The Japanese Mandate, the Marshall and Caroline Islands, sat directly on several possible flight paths if Earhart had been blown off course. These islands were closer to Howland than Gardner. They had Japanese military installations. They were, by multiple accounts, strictly off-limits to American vessels. The U.S. Navy's official report is careful about this. It notes that search operations covered approximately 250,000 square miles, but doesn't specify exactly which areas were excluded. Unofficial accounts are blunter. The Navy deliberately avoided Japanese-controlled waters to prevent an international incident. Remember, this is 1937. Japan had already invaded Manchuria. Relations with the United States were deteriorating. American military vessels approaching Japanese island installations without permission could be interpreted as reconnaissance, or worse, an act of war. So the search happened everywhere except in the most politically sensitive zone. This isn't speculation. Multiple sources confirm that Japanese territories were explicitly excluded from search patterns. An American civilian would find this shocking. Someone's life is at stake, and we're worried about international boundaries? But in 1937, without modern maritime law or established search and rescue treaties, those boundaries were hard stops. By July 9, 7 days after Earhart disappeared, the phantom signals had stopped entirely. Either the batteries had died, the radio had been destroyed by seawater, or the signals were never real in the first place. The Navy kept searching anyway. On July 13, the aircraft carrier USS Lexington arrived with 63 aircraft, ready to conduct the most comprehensive aerial search yet attempted. The Lexington's planes flew grid patterns for days, covering a rectangular search area 600 miles by 400 miles. They saw nothing. No oil slicks. No wreckage. No reflective surfaces that might indicate a downed aircraft. The ocean had swallowed a 12,000-pound metal airplane without leaving a trace visible from the air. On July 19, the search officially ended. Earhart and Noonan were declared lost at sea. The presumption, they had run out of fuel, crashed into the ocean near Howland Island, and sank immediately. Case closed. Except the phantom signals raised a question nobody could answer. If Earhart went straight into the ocean, who was transmitting for 11 days after she disappeared? A line of position isn't a place. It's a mathematical possibility, A line drawn on a map representing everywhere an aircraft could be based on a single bearing. When Earhart transmitted, "We are on the line 157 to 337, she was giving the Itasca navigational information that should have narrowed her location. The numbers refer to compass bearings: 157 degrees southeast, 337 degrees northwest. Drawn on a map, this line runs through Howland Island, but it also runs for hundreds of miles in both directions, passing through or near multiple other landmasses. Fred Noonan, Earhart's navigator, would have calculated this line using celestial navigation, measuring the angle of the sun with a sextant to determine their position. In 1937, this was standard practice for oceanic flight. The problem: a line of position only tells you where you are along one axis. To pinpoint your exact location, you need a second bearing, a crossing line that intersects the first. Earhart never transmitted that second bearing. Why? 3 possibilities. First, they didn't have time to calculate a second bearing before fuel ran out. Second, they were already too low on fuel to wait for another sun sighting. Third, and this is what haunts investigators, they could see land and thought they knew exactly where they were, making a second bearing seem unnecessary. Here's where that line gets interesting. At 337 degrees from Howland, extended northwest, the line passes near several small islands in the Phoenix Group. At 157 degrees southeast, it passes near Baker Island, another tiny atoll. Extend the line further northwest, and you start approaching the Gilbert Islands, British territory with better chances of habitation and water. Extend it southeast, and you're heading into empty ocean. Navigator consensus suggests Earhart was likely flying northwest on that line when she transmitted. Why? Because in her earlier transmissions, she'd said she was running north and south, flying perpendicular to her intended course, trying to intersect Howland Island. If she couldn't find Howland and was running low on fuel, the logical move would be flying northwest along the line toward other islands, potential emergency landing sites. The closest substantial landmass northwest of Howland along that bearing: Gardner Island, now called Nikumaroro, approximately 350 nautical miles away. The island is a coral atoll about 4 miles long and 1 mile wide, with a shallow lagoon and a reef flat along the northwestern shore. In 1937, it was uninhabited. But it had been inhabited before. A British survey expedition had established a small outpost there in the 1890s, and a large freighter, the SS Norwich City, had wrecked on the reef in 1929 and remained visible as a rusting hulk. If Earhart and Noonan were flying northwest on line 157 to 337, looking for any place to land, they would have seen that shipwreck. A massive visual reference point on an otherwise empty reef. Could they have attempted a landing there? The International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, TIGHAR, has been arguing yes since 1988. Their hypothesis: Earhart reached Nikumaroro, spotted the reef flat exposed by low tide, and successfully landed the Electra on the coral. The plane would have been intact initially. The radio would still work. And at low tide, with the Electra sitting on dry reef, Earhart could transmit those phantom signals the Navy had been hearing. This theory has problems, but before we get to those, American listeners need to understand how different British colonial administration was from U.S. territorial management in 1937. The Phoenix Islands were technically under British authority as part of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony. But authority is a stretch. These islands were visited maybe once every few years by a British survey ship. There was no regular patrol, no resident administrator, no infrastructure. If an American aircraft crashed there, the British government might not know for weeks or months. Compare this to American territorial administration in the Pacific. Howland Island, where Earhart was supposed to land, had been claimed by the United States and was being actively developed as a refueling station. The U.S. government had people there, infrastructure, radio contact with Hawaii. If something went wrong at Howland, authorities would know immediately. But Gardner Island? It might as well have been the far side of the moon. The USS Colorado's aircraft flew over Gardner Island on July 9, 1937. They saw nothing. No plane, no people, no distress signals. But here's the critical detail most Americans don't realize. They were looking from altitude, flying at high speed over an island covered with dense vegetation. If the Electra had been partially obscured by trees or reef structure, if Earhart and Noonan were sheltering from the sun, if the tide was high and the plane was partially submerged, the flyover might have missed everything. In modern American search and rescue, aerial reconnaissance uses infrared cameras, GPS tracking, and multiple passes at different altitudes specifically to avoid this problem. In 1937, you had pilots looking with their eyes, flying once over an island, reporting nothing seen, and moving on. The TIGHAR theory suggests Earhart and Noonan survived for days, possibly weeks, as castaways on Nikumaroro. They transmitted distress signals when the tide was low and the radio was functional. They searched for fresh water. The island has no permanent streams but collects rainwater in tidal pools. They ate coconuts, caught fish, and waited for rescue that never came. The transmission stopped around July 13 when either the batteries died or rising tides finally destroyed the aircraft. But there's a counter-theory that takes line 157 to 337 in a completely different direction. What if Earhart wasn't flying northwest toward British territory? What if navigational errors or weather pushed her northeast, toward the Marshall Islands, the Japanese-controlled territory the U.S. Navy deliberately avoided searching? This is where the case splits into three competing narratives, each with evidence, each with fatal flaws. Understanding these theories requires understanding not just aviation or navigation, but the geopolitical reality of the Pacific in 1937, a reality where international boundaries could determine whether someone lived or died, and where the truth might have been deliberately buried to avoid a war that was coming anyway. The line 157 to 337 pointed in two directions. Which direction Earhart flew would determine not just where she died, but whether anyone would ever find her. In 1960, 23 years after Earhart disappeared, a woman named Josephine Blanco came forward with a story that should have changed everything. Blanco, a native of Saipan in the Mariana Islands, told CBS reporters she had been a young girl in 1937 when Japanese soldiers brought two American prisoners to the island. One was a woman. The other was a man. The woman had short hair and wore pants, unusual for the time. Blanco said she saw them briefly near the harbor before they were taken away by Japanese military police. She never saw them again. Saipan was part of the Japanese Mandate, the network of Pacific islands Japan controlled after World War I. By 1937, these islands had become heavily militarized staging grounds for Japan's expansion into Asia. American civilians weren't allowed there. American military vessels that approached were warned away. The islands were, effectively, a locked box, and everyone knew Japan was hiding something inside. Blanco's account was detailed. She described the woman as thin, wearing a light-colored shirt and dark pants. The man was taller, possibly injured. They looked exhausted, sun-damaged, like they'd been at sea or stranded somewhere harsh. When CBS investigators pressed her on dates, she placed the sighting in mid to late 1937, shortly after news of Earhart's disappearance had reached the Pacific. Here's where American listeners need to understand something about post-war Pacific testimony that has no real equivalent in U.S. legal experience. After Japan surrendered in 1945, the Mariana and Marshall Islands became U.S. trust territories. Suddenly, islanders who had lived under Japanese occupation for decades could speak freely, and many had stories about American prisoners. But these testimonies came 8, 10, sometimes 15 years after the alleged events. There were no police reports from 1937. No photographs. No documentation. Just memories, filtered through war, occupation, and cultural translation. In the American legal system, witness testimony this old would face massive credibility challenges. Defense attorneys would highlight the time gap, the lack of corroboration, the possibility of false memory or confusion with other events. But in the Pacific Theater, where Japan had systematically destroyed records before surrendering, these oral testimonies were sometimes the only evidence that certain events had ever occurred. Blanco wasn't alone. Over the next 2 decades, more than a dozen Marshall Islands and Saipan residents came forward with similar accounts. A fisherman on Mealy Atoll claimed he saw a silver aircraft crash into the reef in July 1937. Another witness said Japanese soldiers had recovered a twin-engine plane and transported it by barge. A Marshallese man named Bilaman Ameron told investigators his father had seen the plane and helped Japanese forces guard it before it was moved. The crash site described was consistent with Earhart's flight path if she had continued west past Howland instead of turning northwest. Mealy Atoll sits roughly 800 miles northwest of Howland, well within the Electra's fuel range if Earhart had flown a slightly different bearing. The atoll has shallow reefs where an aircraft could potentially ditch without sinking immediately. And in 1937, it was firmly under Japanese military control. Here's the theory. Earhart and Noonan, unable to find Howland, continued flying west hoping to reach the Gilbert or Marshall Islands where they could refuel. They entered Japanese waters, either knowingly or by accident. The aircraft ran out of fuel and crashed near Mealy Atoll. Local fishermen saw it happen and reported it to Japanese authorities. The military responded, not with rescue, but with suspicion. Why suspicion? Because in 1937, Japan was building military installations throughout the Pacific in direct violation of their League of Nations mandate, which explicitly prohibited militarization of these territories. Any American aircraft in the area would be viewed as potential reconnaissance. The Japanese military's default assumption, Earhart was a spy. This is where American and Japanese legal systems diverged catastrophically in the 1930s. In the United States, even if someone was suspected of espionage, they would be detained, questioned, and processed through a legal system with at least nominal protections. In Imperial Japan's military zones, foreign nationals suspected of intelligence gathering could be detained indefinitely without charges, without consular access, without any notification to their home government. They simply disappeared into the military justice system, and that system kept no records Americans could later access. The theory continues. Earhart and Noonan were taken to Saipan, the administrative center of the Japanese mandate. They were interrogated. The Japanese military concluded they were either spies or had inadvertently seen military installations they shouldn't have. Either way, they couldn't be released. The two aviators died in Japanese custody, possibly from dysentery, possibly from mistreatment, possibly executed. This theory solves several mysteries. It explains why the U.S. Navy never found wreckage. The plane was in Japanese waters they couldn't search. It explains the phantom radio signals Earhart transmitted briefly after crashing before Japanese forces confiscated the radio. It explains why no remains were ever found. They were buried or disposed of by Japanese military personnel who had every reason to hide what had happened. But it creates a massive new problem. If this theory is true, the U.S. government knew about it and covered it up. Because after World War II, when America occupied Saipan and gained access to Japanese records, investigators specifically looked into the Earhart case. They interviewed witnesses. They searched former Japanese military facilities. They found nothing conclusive. Or at least nothing they were willing to make public. In 2017, a photograph surfaced that reignited the theory. The image, found in the U.S. National Archives, showed a dock in the Marshall Islands with several people visible. Investigators claimed one figure resembled Amelia Earhart, another resembled Fred Noonan, and a barge in the background appeared to be carrying something aircraft-sized. The History Channel produced a documentary suggesting this was proof Earhart had been captured. The photograph was quickly debunked. Researchers found it had been published in a Japanese travel book in 1935, 2 years before Earhart disappeared. But the debunking didn't kill the theory. It just proved how desperately people wanted evidence, any evidence, that could explain what happened to America's most famous missing aviator. Here's what we know for certain. Japanese military records from the Mandate Islands were systematically destroyed before surrender. If Earhart had been detained there, the documentation would have been burned along with everything else. The witnesses are real. Their testimonies are consistent across decades. But they're impossible to verify. So we're left with a question that cuts to the heart of international investigation. When witness testimony is all you have, when official records have been destroyed, when two governments have competing interests in the truth, how do you determine what actually happened? The Marshall Islands theory points one direction. But 350 miles southeast of Howland, on a coral atoll slowly being reclaimed by the ocean, investigators found something else. Something physical. Something that suggested Earhart never made it to Japanese waters at all. In 1940, 3 years after Earhart vanished, a British colonial officer named Gerald Gallagher was surveying Nikumaroro Island for potential settlement. The island had been uninhabited for decades, but the British government was considering it for a new colony as part of the Phoenix Island settlement scheme. Gallagher and his team were mapping the coastline, checking for fresh water sources, assessing whether families could survive there. On the southeast end of the island, in an area thick with vegetation near an old shipwreck, they found something unexpected. Human bones. Gallagher immediately reported the discovery to his superiors in Fiji. The bones were partial, a skull, some limb bones, ribs. They were scattered, suggesting they'd been disturbed by animals or erosion. Near the bones, Gallagher found other objects, a sextant box of a type used by navigators, a woman's shoe, and glass bottles. He carefully collected everything and shipped the remains to Fiji for analysis. Dr. David Hoodless, the principal medical officer in Fiji, examined the bones in 1941 and concluded they belonged to a male, approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall. Based on this identification, the British colonial administration dismissed any connection to Amelia Earhart. The bones were European, certainly, but clearly not from a famous female aviator. The remains were filed away, and eventually lost. The physical evidence, the only human remains ever found in the entire Earhart search zone, disappeared into colonial bureaucracy. Here's where American audiences need to understand how radically different forensic standards were in 1941 versus today. Dr. Hoodless was a medical doctor, not a forensic anthropologist. He had no specialized training in skeletal analysis. His examination tools were rudimentary by modern standards: basic measurements, visual assessment, comparison to general anatomical charts. In current American practice, these remains would be sent to the FBI forensic lab or a specialized anthropology unit where bone measurements would be digitally scanned, compared against databases, and analyzed using population-specific algorithms that account for variations in skeletal structure across ethnicities and time periods. The bones were gone, but Hoodless measurements survived in the colonial records. In 1998, forensic anthropologists Richard Jantz and Jeff Glickman reanalyzed those measurements using modern techniques. Their conclusion: Hoodless had gotten it wrong. The bones were more consistent with a female of Northern European ancestry, approximately 5 feet 7 inches to 5 feet 8 inches tall. Amelia Earhart's height: 5 feet 7 inches to 5 feet 8 inches. The margin of error in bone-based height estimation is typically 2 to 3 inches, so this match isn't definitive proof. But it's consistent. And the location, Nikumaroro, lying directly on the 157 to 337 line of position Earhart transmitted, makes it more than just coincidence. TIGHAR, the research group investigating the Nikumaroro theory, has returned to the island repeatedly since 1989. They've conducted archaeological excavations at the site where Gallagher found the bones. What they've discovered is a scatter of artifacts that paint a disturbing picture of survival and death. Pieces of aluminum consistent with 1930s aircraft construction. A zipper pull from the 1930s. Fish and bird bones showing cut marks from a knife, suggesting someone was catching and preparing food. A jar that once contained anti-freckle cream, a cosmetic product Earhart was known to use. Pieces of plexiglass consistent with aircraft windows. And most hauntingly, signs of a campsite, fire pits, cleared areas, remnants of shelter construction. Someone survived on Nikumaroro for days, possibly weeks. They caught fish. They built fires. They tried to establish shelter. And then they died. The forensic picture TIGHAR presents is brutal in its simplicity. Earhart landed the Electra on the reef flat at low tide, as the theory suggests. The plane stayed intact long enough for her and Noonan to transmit distress signals, those phantom signals the Navy heard. But the reef destroyed the aircraft within days as tides battered it. Earhart and Noonan moved to higher ground, bringing whatever supplies they could salvage. They waited for rescue that never came. Nikumaroro has no permanent fresh water. It catches rainwater in tidal pools and shallow depressions, but in July, the dry season, those sources are unreliable. Without regular rainfall, dehydration would set in within days. The sun is merciless. Shade is limited. Fish can be caught in the lagoon, but without fresh water, eating protein actually accelerates dehydration. Coconuts provide some moisture, but not enough for 2 people in tropical heat. The timeline fits. The bones were found on the southern end of the island, away from the reef where the plane would have landed. That's where someone would go searching for water or shade. The artifacts were scattered across a wide area, consistent with someone moving around the island, trying different locations, looking for anything that might help them survive. But here's what doesn't fit. If Earhart and Noonan were on Nikumaroro transmitting distress signals, why didn't the USS Colorado's flyover on July 9 spot them? The island is only 4 miles long. The pilots had clear weather. They flew low enough to see the old shipwreck clearly. How do you miss 2 people waving from a beach? TIGHAR's answer: the flyover happened at high tide when the reef was submerged. The pilots were looking for a plane on the reef or in the lagoon. They weren't looking for people in the interior vegetation. Earhart and Noonan might have been sheltering from the sun, or too weak to reach the beach in time, or simply in the wrong location when the planes passed. In American search and rescue, this explanation would be unacceptable. Modern protocol requires multiple passes at different times of day, infrared scanning to detect human heat signatures, and on-ground verification of any island large enough to support survivors. But in 1937, you got one flyover. If the pilots saw nothing, the island was marked clear, and the search moved on. There's another problem. If those bones belong to Earhart, where's Fred Noonan? Gallagher found partial remains from 1 person, not 2. TIGHAR suggests Noonan died separately, possibly at a different location on the island, and his remains were never found or were destroyed by natural processes before the 1940 survey. But that's speculation. Without Noonan's remains, without the original bones for DNA testing, without definitive proof that the artifacts belonged to Earhart's Electra, the Nikumaroro theory remains exactly that, a theory. The aluminum pieces haven't been conclusively matched to Earhart's specific aircraft. The anti-freckle jar is the right type but can't be proven to be hers. The bones are lost, so DNA comparison with Earhart's living relatives is impossible. Every piece of evidence is suggestive but not definitive. So we have 2 theories pointing in opposite directions. Marshall Islands witnesses saying Earhart was captured by Japanese forces. Nikumaroro artifacts suggesting she died as a castaway. Both theories have evidence. Both have problems. And there's a third possibility, the official conclusion, that still hasn't been ruled out. What if Earhart never reached any island at all? The simplest explanation is often the correct one. Amelia Earhart ran out of fuel, crashed into the Pacific Ocean, and sank. This was the U.S. Navy's official conclusion in 1937, and it remains the position of most aviation historians today. The logic is straightforward. Earhart transmitted her last message at 8:43 a.m. reporting she was on line 157 to 337 but gave no indication she could see land. By 10 a.m., her fuel would have been exhausted based on departure time and known fuel capacity. An aircraft ditching in open ocean, even in a controlled landing, would sink within minutes once the fuselage filled with water. The Lockheed Electra was aluminum. It would sink, not float. The water depth around Howland Island ranges from 15,000 to 18,000 feet. At those depths, wreckage would be crushed by pressure, scattered by currents, and eventually buried under sediment. Finding it would be like finding a specific car in a parking lot the size of Colorado, if that parking lot were underwater and covered in darkness. For decades, this theory seemed unprovable. The Pacific is simply too vast, the ocean floor too deep and complex. But in the 21st century, deep-sea sonar technology changed the equation. If the Titanic could be found 3 miles down, why not Earhart's Electra? In 2002, Nauticos Corporation conducted a deep-ocean sonar search northwest of Howland Island, covering 600 square nautical miles. They found nothing. In 2009, researchers from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and other institutions used advanced side-scan sonar to search areas along the 157 to 337 line. Nothing. In 2017, Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who found the Titanic, led an expedition to Nikumaroro to search the waters around the island using remotely operated vehicles. Still nothing. Then, in January 2024, Deep Sea Vision, a marine robotics company, announced they had captured sonar imagery of what appeared to be an aircraft on the ocean floor approximately 16,000 feet deep, roughly 100 miles west of Howland Island. The object was the right size, the right shape, and in a location consistent with Earhart's flight path if she had continued west past Howland before ditching. Here's where American audiences need to understand something about deep-sea salvage law that's radically different from terrestrial property rights. In the United States, if you find a car or plane wreck on land, ownership and jurisdiction are clear. It belongs to someone, and there are established legal procedures for recovery. But in international waters at extreme depth, maritime law becomes murky. The wreck might be U.S. property as a former American aircraft. It might be considered an archaeological site protected by UNESCO conventions. It might belong to whoever finds it under salvage law. Or it might belong to Earhart's heirs under Admiralty law. Deep Sea Vision's sonar image sparked immediate excitement. The object appeared to have a wingspan consistent with the Electra's 55-foot width. It was lying on a relatively flat section of seafloor, suggesting it had settled rather than crashed violently. The location made sense. If Earhart had missed Howland and continued flying west looking for any landmass, she would have been in that area when fuel ran out. But sonar images are deceiving. They show shape, not detail. The aircraft could be a rock formation. It could be debris from a ship. It could be natural seafloor topology that happens to look aircraft-shaped from certain angles. Until someone sends a submersible down to actually photograph the object, it remains an unconfirmed possibility, like so much else in this case. The challenge of deep ocean verification has no real equivalent in American terrestrial investigation. If police found what looked like a car in a lake, they'd send divers down immediately. But at 16,000 feet depth, immediately becomes, if we can secure funding, technology, and permits, a process that takes months or years. Deep Sea Vision has stated they plan a return expedition to photograph the object, but as of 2026, that hasn't happened yet. The crash and sink theory solves one massive problem the other theories struggle with. It explains why nobody found Earhart despite intensive searching. If the plane went straight into deep water near Howland, it's simply gone. No reef landing, no Japanese capture, no bones on distant islands. Just an aircraft at the bottom of the ocean in one of the least accessible places on Earth. This theory also aligns with statistical reality. In the 1930s, approximately 30% of transoceanic flights ended in crashes or disappearances. Aviation was dangerous. Navigation was primitive. Mechanical failures were common. Earhart's disappearance, tragic as it was, wasn't unique, it was part of a pattern. What made it different was who she was, not what happened to her. But the crash and sink theory has one critical weakness. It doesn't explain the phantom radio signals. If Earhart ditched in deep water at 9 o'clock or 10 a.m. on July 2nd, who was transmitting on her frequency for the next week? The Navy logged those signals. Multiple stations heard them. Were they all hoaxes? All misidentified interference from other sources? The official Navy position has always been that the post-loss signals were not credible. Radio operators wanted to believe they were hearing Earhart, so they interpreted random static and interference as her call sign. Human psychology, not radio reality. In controlled tests years later, researchers demonstrated that atmospheric conditions in July 1937 could have caused signals from Australia or Asia to appear as if they originated from the Pacific. In American criminal investigation, this kind of witness unreliability is well documented. When people desperately want to find someone, they see evidence everywhere. They misidentify strangers, they interpret random information as clues, they create patterns where none exist. The phantom signals might be the 1937 equivalent of false sightings after a missing person case goes public. So we have three theories. Japanese capture, supported by witness testimony but no physical evidence. Nikumaroro castaway death, supported by artifacts but no definitive proof. crash and sink near Howland, supported by statistical probability and recent sonar imagery but no confirmed wreckage. Each theory has advocates who are absolutely certain they're right. Each has evidence that seems compelling in isolation. And each has fatal gaps that prevent definitive proof. The question isn't which theory has the most evidence, it's which theory's gaps are easiest to explain away. But there's something none of these theories adequately address. Something that gets lost in debates about sonar images and bone measurements and witness credibility. The question of why this search was designed the way it was in the first place. Why certain areas were searched while others weren't. Why international politics determined where rescuers could look for an American citizen in distress. The search for Amelia Earhart wasn't just about finding a missing plane. It was about navigating a geopolitical minefield that would explode into World War II just 4 years later. The U.S. Navy spent $4 million searching for Amelia Earhart in 1937, roughly $85 million in today's currency. It was the most expensive air-sea rescue operation in history at that point. And it deliberately avoided searching the areas where she was most likely to be. Understanding why requires understanding something most Americans never think about. Maritime jurisdiction in international waters has no terrestrial equivalent. When someone goes missing in Kansas, police don't stop at county lines because of international treaties. But in 1937, when someone disappeared in the Pacific, invisible lines drawn on maps determined where rescuers could and couldn't look, even if those lines meant the difference between life and death. The Pacific in 1937 was a patchwork of colonial territories and mandates, each with different rules about foreign vessels. Howland Island, where Earhart was supposed to land, was U.S. territory. America could search there freely. The Phoenix Islands to the southeast were British. The Navy needed permission, which took days to obtain through diplomatic channels. The Marshall and Caroline Islands to the west were Japanese mandate territory, and Japan had made clear that American military vessels approaching those islands would be considered hostile acts. This created an absurd situation. The Marshall Islands were closer to Earhart's last known position than many areas the Navy did search. If she had been blown off course by headwinds or navigational error, the Marshalls were a logical place to look. But the U.S. Navy had intelligence suggesting Japan was fortifying those islands in violation of the post-World War I treaties that gave them administrative control. American reconnaissance aircraft had been warned away from the area multiple times. Sending a full search flotilla into Japanese waters would either start a war or confirm to Japan that America knew about the illegal militarization. So the Navy made a calculated decision. Earhart's life wasn't worth a war. Not yet, anyway. 4 years later, that same calculation would flip when Pearl Harbor burned. But in July 1937, diplomatic stability took priority over rescue operations. Here's what Americans need to understand about pre-war maritime law. There was no equivalent to the International Convention on Maritime Search and Rescue that exists today. Modern Coast Guard operations can cross into foreign territorial waters during rescue missions under established protocols. If a vessel is sinking off the coast of Mexico, U.S. Coast Guard cutters don't wait for diplomatic clearance. They respond immediately, and international law protects that response. But in 1937, no such framework existed. Each country controlled its waters absolutely, and foreign military vessels entering without permission were treated as invasions. The USS Lexington, the aircraft carrier that led the largest phase of the search, had 63 aircraft and covered over 151,000 square miles of ocean. That's an area larger than Germany. But look at a map of the search grid, and you'll see a conspicuous gap to the west, a circular exclusion zone around the Japanese Mandate Islands. The Lexington's search patterns went north, south, east, everywhere except there. Captain Lee Noyes, who commanded the Lexington during the search, later wrote in his memoirs that he had been explicitly ordered to avoid Japanese territorial waters. Not just the 12-mile limit that constituted official territory, but a much wider buffer zone to prevent any accusation of reconnaissance. The order came from the highest levels of the Navy, possibly from Secretary of the Navy Claude Swanson himself, and reflected State Department concerns about provoking Japan. Compare this to how modern American search operations work. When Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared in 2014, American P. 8 Poseidon aircraft joined search operations that crossed multiple national boundaries: Indonesian waters, Australian search zones, international waters claimed by various nations. Modern treaties and mutual assistance agreements made this possible. In 1937, the equivalent would have required individual diplomatic negotiations with each country, taking weeks or months. The British were more cooperative, but not much faster. The Phoenix Islands, including Gardner/Nikumaroro, were surveyed by USS Colorado aircraft on July 9, 7 days after Earhart disappeared. 7 days. If Earhart had been alive on one of those islands transmitting distress signals, she was waiting an entire week for the first aerial search. For comparison, modern Coast Guard doctrine requires aerial reconnaissance of potential crash sites within 24 hours whenever possible, and immediate scrambling of search assets when distress signals are received. Why the delay? Because the Colorado had to steam from Hawaii to the search zone, refuel, launch aircraft, and coordinate with British colonial authorities about search areas in British territory. There was no prepositioned search and rescue infrastructure in the Pacific. No Coast Guard stations. No emergency coordination centers. When something went wrong, you assembled a rescue mission from scratch, and that took days. The Itasca, the Coast Guard cutter stationed at Howland specifically to support Earhart's landing, began searching immediately on July 2. But the Itasca was one ship with limited range and no aircraft. It could search the immediate vicinity of Howland, steaming in expanding circles and scanning the horizon. That's what it did for 3 days until Navy ships arrived with broader search capabilities. If Earhart had ditched 100 miles from Howland, well within her possible range, the Itasca might have passed within sight without seeing her. Modern American Coast Guard cutters carry helicopters with infrared sensors that can detect body heat from miles away. They use satellites to track emergency beacons. They coordinate with commercial shipping to redirect vessels towards search areas. In 1937, you had sailors standing on deck with binoculars, looking at an ocean that all looks the same, hoping to spot something reflective or unusual in the endless blue. The search officially ended on July 19, 17 days after Earhart disappeared. By Navy calculation, she would have run out of fuel by July 2 around 10 a.m. Even if she had survived a ditching, the odds of surviving 17 days without rescue in the open Pacific were effectively zero. The decision to end the search was pragmatic and, by 1937 standards, reasonable. But here's what haunts this case: we don't know if it was reasonable, because we don't know if the search looked in the right places. The Marshall Islands went unsearched. Large sections of ocean west of Howland were excluded from search grids. Gardner Island got one aerial pass, 7 days late. The search was massive by 1937 standards, but had gaping holes determined not by where Earhart might be, but by where American ships were allowed to look. If Earhart had crashed in Japanese waters, the search would never have found her because the search never looked there. If she had made it to a remote island in a politically sensitive zone, she might have died waiting for rescuers who were ordered to stay away. The search failed not because it wasn't big enough, but because international borders mattered more than an American life. This isn't speculation. This is documented fact. The U.S. Navy had the capability to search Japanese waters. They chose not to because the geopolitical cost was too high. Amelia Earhart disappeared into a gap between nations, and that gap was never searched. 4 years later, when America and Japan went to war, one of the first things the U.S. military did was occupy those same Marshall Islands they had avoided in 1937. They found extensive Japanese military installations, the exact fortifications Japan had been hiding. But by then, any trace of Amelia Earhart was long gone. The question isn't whether the Navy searched hard enough. It's whether they were searching in the wrong ocean entirely. The most frustrating aspect of the Earhart case isn't lack of evidence. It's that evidence keeps appearing, then vanishing before it can be properly verified. The bones found on Nikumaroro in 1940 were measured, catalogued, and then lost somewhere in Fiji's colonial archives. The exact location, unknown. Attempts to find them in the 1990s failed. They're simply gone. Modern DNA analysis that could definitively prove or disprove the Earhart connection. Impossible. The only physical human remains ever found in the search zone are unavailable for testing. The photograph allegedly showing Earhart on a dock in the Marshall Islands? Published in a Japanese book in 1935, 2 years before she disappeared. The image that seemed to show her aircraft on a barge? Debunked as a different vessel entirely. The sonar contact from 2024 that looked like an aircraft? Still unconfirmed, waiting for a follow-up expedition that may or may not happen. This pattern of appearing and disappearing evidence has no real parallel in modern American criminal investigation. When the FBI finds a bone, it goes into a secured evidence locker with chain-of-custody documentation. When police photograph a crime scene, those images are stored in redundant systems with digital backups. When forensic evidence is collected, it's preserved specifically so future technology can reanalyze it. But Earhart disappeared in 1937, investigated under 1930s to 1940s colonial administration standards, with evidence handled by British officials in Fiji who had no reason to believe they were preserving materials for a case that would remain open 90 years later. They measured some bones, decided they weren't Amelia Earhart, and filed them away. When the files were reorganized decades later, the bones got lost. Standard bureaucratic chaos, except this particular chaos eliminated the single best piece of evidence in aviation's greatest mystery. TIGHAR has tried to compensate by searching for other physical evidence on Nikumaroro. Between 1989 and 2019, they conducted 13 expeditions to the island. They've excavated the site where the bones were found. They've used ground-penetrating radar to search for buried wreckage. They've analyzed soil samples for traces of aircraft fuel or lubricants. They've collected dozens of artifacts from the 1930s era. Every artifact they find creates a new debate. In 1991, they recovered a piece of aluminum measuring about 23 inches by 19 inches from the area near where the bones were discovered. Analysis suggested it came from an aircraft, and the dimensions matched a repair patch that had been installed on Earhart's Electra during her world flight. Investigators found a photo showing Earhart's plane in Miami with a patch on the fuselage, and the patch appeared to be the same size and location as the Nikumaroro aluminum. In American forensic terms, this would be significant circumstantial evidence. Not proof, but a strong connection. However, the aluminum piece couldn't be definitively matched to Earhart's specific aircraft without original manufacturing records or chemical composition analysis comparing it to known Electra components. The dimensions matched, but dimensions alone don't prove origin. Then there's the jar. In 2012, TIGHAR found fragments of a glass jar on Nikumaroro that, when reconstructed, appeared to be a container for lanolin freckle cream, a specific 1930s cosmetic product. Investigators discovered that Earhart was associated with this brand and may have used it. But may have used isn't definitely carried on her flight. The Phoenix Islands were briefly settled by colonists in the late 1930s and early 1940s, after Earhart disappeared but before regular documentation. Any of those colonists could have brought the jar. Here's where American evidentiary standards create problems for the Nikumaroro theory. In a U.S. court, you need to establish chain of custody and prove that evidence is connected to the specific incident being investigated. Finding a 1930s cosmetic jar on an island doesn't prove Amelia Earhart was there unless you can exclude other explanations, and TIGHAR hasn't been able to do that. The island wasn't completely isolated. Ships passed through. Colonists arrived. The jar could have come from anywhere. The same problem afflicts the Marshall Islands theory. Witness testimony from the 1960s about events in 1937 would face brutal cross-examination in American courts. Memory degrades over time. Details get confused. People incorporate information they learned later into memories of earlier events. Without corroborating physical evidence, a piece of aircraft, a document, a photograph that isn't debunked, the witness statements remain interesting but unprovable. In 2017, when the History Channel documentary claimed to have found proof of the Japanese capture theory, forensic experts quickly dismantled it. The photograph predated Earhart's disappearance. The facial recognition analysis claiming to match Earhart in the image was based on such low resolution that it could match thousands of people. The documentary was criticized for presenting speculation as fact, exactly what responsible investigators try to avoid. But the biggest evidentiary problem is what happened after World War II. When the United States occupied Saipan, military investigators specifically searched for evidence of Earhart. They interviewed locals. They examined former Japanese military facilities. They looked through captured records. According to official reports, they found nothing substantive, no documents mentioning American prisoners matching Earhart's description, no grave sites, no aircraft parts that could be linked to the Electra. Here's what Americans need to understand about occupied territory investigations. They're not neutral. In 1945, the U.S. military was conducting war crimes investigations, searching for evidence of atrocities, and processing thousands of Japanese documents about military operations. If they found evidence that Earhart had been captured and killed by Japanese forces, that evidence would have been politically explosive, potential justification for additional war crimes charges, or embarrassing proof that America had failed to rescue one of its citizens. Some investigators believe the evidence was found and suppressed. Others believe it was found and lost in the chaos of occupation. Still, others believe it simply never existed. Without access to complete Japanese military records, many of which were destroyed before surrender, we can't know which interpretation is correct. The crash and sink theory avoids these evidentiary problems by not requiring evidence at all. If the plane is at the bottom of the ocean, we wouldn't expect to find bones on islands or witness testimony about capture. The absence of evidence becomes evidence itself. Proof that Earhart went straight down in deep water where nothing could be recovered with 1937 technology. The 2024 sonar contact is the first potential physical evidence supporting this theory. But potential is doing heavy lifting in that sentence. Deep-sea vision captured an image of something aircraft-shaped at extreme depth. Until someone photographs it close-up, it's just a sonar shadow that might be a plane, might be a rock formation, might be wreckage from one of the dozens of other aircraft that crashed in the Pacific during World War II. Modern American crash investigation has tools that didn't exist in 1937. Underwater drones can reach extreme depths. Side-scan sonar can map entire ocean floors. DNA analysis can identify remains from tiny fragments. But all these tools are useless if you're looking in the wrong place, and after 89 years, we still don't know where the right place is. 3 theories. 3 sets of evidence. And every piece of evidence is either lost, debunked, or insufficient to prove anything definitively. The case remains open not because we don't have theories, but because we can't eliminate any of them. But one question has never been adequately answered. A question that goes beyond evidence and theories and searches. Why did Amelia Earhart's final radio message contain those specific numbers, 157 to 337, and nothing else? We are on the line 157 to 337. 8 words. The last anyone heard from Amelia Earhart. But what did those numbers actually tell the Itasca? A line of position is a navigational concept that doesn't translate well to modern GPS-dependent flying. In 1937, when you wanted to know where you were over the ocean, you used a sextant to measure the angle of the sun above the horizon. That measurement, combined with the precise time and some trigonometry, gave you a line on the map, a bearing showing everywhere you could possibly be based on that single sun observation. The problem: a line extends infinitely in both directions. You know you're somewhere on that line, but you don't know where. To pinpoint exact location, you need a second observation, either another sun site at a different time, or a radio direction finding bearing, or visual confirmation of a landmark. Earhart never transmitted that second piece of information. Here's what 157 to 337 told the Itasca. Earhart and Noonan had taken a sun site, calculated their line of position, and determined it ran on a northwest-southeast axis through or near Howland Island. The numbers are reciprocal bearings. 157 degrees and 337 degrees are opposite directions on the same line. If you're flying northwest on bearing 337, you're on the same line as someone flying southeast on bearing 157. Radio experts who've analyzed the transmission note something critical. Earhart's voice was loud and clear, indicating strong signal strength. In 1937 radio terms, that meant she was probably within 50 to 100 miles of Howland. The Itasca was receiving her at maximum strength, 5 to 5, in radio terminology, the highest possible rating. She was close. But in the Pacific, close still means an area of thousands of square miles. What Earhart didn't say is as important as what she did. She didn't report seeing land. She didn't give a specific location. She didn't indicate whether she was flying northwest or southeast on that line. She didn't say how much fuel remained. And critically, she didn't acknowledge hearing any of the Itasca's transmissions. This suggests several possibilities. First, she might have been too busy flying to provide more detail, hands on the controls, eyes scanning for the island, no time for extended radio communication. Second, she might have been conserving battery power for brief transmissions. Third, and most troubling, she might have been losing altitude, preparing for an emergency landing, with only seconds to transmit position before impact. American aviation experts who've studied the transmission timeline note that Earhart's earlier messages showed increasing urgency. At 7:42 a.m., she transmitted, "We must be on you but cannot see you." Frustration, confusion, running low on fuel but still expecting to find Howland. An hour later, at 8:43 a.m., she transmitted just the line of position with no additional commentary. That suggests deteriorating conditions. Either fuel was nearly gone, or she'd made a decision to land somewhere on that line immediately. Navigator Fred Noonan would have calculated the 157 to 337 line. He was experienced, professional, and would have known exactly what information the Itasca needed. If he had time to calculate a more precise position, he would have transmitted it. The fact that he gave only the line suggests urgency. This is what we know right now, and we might not have time to calculate more. Here's where modern American emergency communication protocols would have changed everything. Today, aircraft in distress transmit continuous GPS coordinates automatically through emergency locator transmitters. Air traffic control can track position in real time. Even if voice communication fails, the aircraft's exact location is known within meters. In 1937, if you didn't verbally report your position, nobody knew where you were. The Itasca tried to help. Immediately after Earhart's final transmission, they sent continuous signals on multiple frequencies, hoping she could use her direction finder to home in on them. They generated smoke to create a visual signal. They transmitted voice, code, everything they had. But if Earhart's receiver couldn't pick up those frequencies, and evidence suggests it couldn't, all that effort was useless. Radio direction finding in 1937 required the aircraft to receive a signal and use an antenna to determine which direction it was coming from. But Earhart had removed her long-range antenna. Her remaining equipment could receive only certain frequencies, and the Itasca wasn't transmitting on all of them simultaneously. It was a coordination failure. Both sides had radios, but they couldn't establish the two-way link needed for direction finding. In American terms, this would be like calling 911 and hearing the dispatcher, but the dispatcher can't hear you. You know help is trying to respond, but you can't tell them where you are. That's the situation Earhart faced in her final minutes aloft. 3 interpretations of 157 to 337 have emerged over decades of analysis. The official Navy interpretation: Earhart was on that line somewhere near Howland, ran out of fuel shortly after transmitting, and ditched in deep water where she sank immediately. This interpretation assumes she never saw land, and the line was simply the best position information she could provide before going down. The TIGHAR interpretation: Earhart was flying northwest on the 337 bearing, looking for any island to land on, and reached Nikumaroro approximately 350 miles from Howland. This interpretation assumes she had enough fuel to continue beyond Howland and was actively searching for an alternative landing site along the line. The Japanese capture interpretation: Earhart was blown off course by wind or navigational error, flew northwest but ended up west of the line, and reached the Marshall Islands where she crashed and was taken prisoner. This interpretation assumes the 157 to 337 transmission was based on a miscalculation and her actual position was different from what she reported. Each interpretation requires different assumptions about fuel remaining, flight decisions, and navigational accuracy. Each leads to a completely different search zone. And each is consistent with the actual words Earhart transmitted. This is the fundamental problem with the case. The last message is precise enough to sound informative, but vague enough to mean almost anything. A line of position extending hundreds of miles in two directions, transmitted at maximum signal strength suggesting proximity but with no visual confirmation of land. It's simultaneously the best clue we have and completely insufficient to determine what happened next. Modern American crash investigators would never accept this ambiguity. They would reconstruct the flight path using every available data point, fuel calculations, wind patterns, radio transmission timing, known navigation techniques. They would narrow the search zone to the highest probability area and search it systematically. But in 1937, that reconstruction wasn't possible with available technology. The Navy made educated guesses, searched the most likely areas, and when they found nothing, declared Earhart lost at sea. The investigation ended not because it was solved, but because it hit the limits of what 1930s technology could determine. 89 years later, we have better technology but the same fundamental problem. We don't know which direction Earhart flew on that line. Until we do, we're searching an area the size of Texas, hoping to find a 38-foot-long aircraft that's been underwater or buried for nearly a century. The final transmission told us where Earhart thought she was. But it didn't tell us where she actually ended up. In 2018, forensic dogs trained to detect human remains were brought to Nikumaroro Island. They alerted on 4 locations. Soil samples were taken. DNA analysis was attempted. The results were inconclusive. This is the state of the Earhart investigation in the 21st century. Endless testing, occasional breakthroughs, and nothing definitive. Unlike most American cold cases, which remain cold because evidence doesn't exist, the Earhart case remains open because evidence exists everywhere, and nowhere. 3 competing theories, each with enough support to seem plausible, each with enough problems to prevent closure. The Japanese capture theory gained renewed attention in the 2010s when researchers began systematically interviewing the last surviving witnesses in the Marshall Islands. Many were elderly, in their 80s or 90s, recounting stories they'd heard as children or young adults. The accounts were remarkably consistent. A silver twin-engine plane crashed near Mealy Atoll, Japanese soldiers recovered it, 2 Americans were taken away. But consistency doesn't equal accuracy. Multiple witnesses can share the same false memory, especially when the story has been told and retold within a community for decades. In American criminal investigation, this is called memory contamination. When witnesses discuss an event among themselves, their individual memories merge into a consensus narrative that may or may not reflect what actually happened. After 80-plus years of community storytelling, it's impossible to separate original memories from constructed ones. The witnesses believe what they're saying, but belief doesn't make it true. The Nikumaroro theory has the opposite problem: physical evidence without context. TIGHAR has recovered aluminum fragments, glass bottles, bone fragments from fish and birds showing knife marks, a zipper pull, and that freckle cream jar. Each item individually could have innocent explanations. Collectively, they paint a picture of someone surviving on the island in the late 1930s. But that someone can't be definitively identified as Earhart without the original human bones, which are lost. In 2018, a new analysis of the 1940 bone measurements was published comparing them not just to Earhart's known height, but to her specific body proportions based on photographs and clothing measurements. The conclusion: the bones were more similar to Amelia Earhart than to 99% of individuals in a large reference sample. That sounds definitive. But it's based on measurements taken 80 years ago by a doctor with no forensic training, using techniques that modern anthropologists consider unreliable. In an American court, this would be challenged immediately. Defense attorneys would point out that conclusions based on potentially inaccurate historical measurements aren't the same as conclusions based on actual bones examined with modern techniques. The analysis might be excellent, but if the underlying data is flawed, the conclusions are suspect. The crash and sink theory remains the default position of most aviation historians precisely because it doesn't require complex explanations. Plane runs out of fuel, plane crashes, plane sinks. It's what happened to dozens of other aircraft attempting transoceanic flights in the 1930s. The 2024 sonar contact adds potential evidence, if it's actually an aircraft, if it's the right type of aircraft, if it can be accessed for confirmation. But here's the problem. Even if Deep Sea Vision's sonar target is the Electra, it doesn't prove Earhart went straight down. She could have crashed near Howland, escaped in a life raft, and drifted to another island before dying. She could have ditched, transmitted distress signals from a partially submerged aircraft for days, then sunk when the wreckage finally broke apart. The location of the plane doesn't necessarily indicate the location of the crew. This is standard in American aviation crash investigation. The wreckage and the victims are often found in different places. Currents move bodies. Debris scatters. You need both the aircraft and human remains to reconstruct what happened, and in the Earhart case, we have neither confirmed. In 2020, TIGHAR announced they were suspending further expeditions to Nikumaroro due to funding constraints and the difficulty of reaching concrete conclusions from surface archaeology. After 30-plus years and 13 expeditions, they'd found enough to sustain the theory but not enough to prove it. The island had given up all the easy evidence. Anything remaining would require extensive excavation, ground-penetrating radar surveys across the entire atoll, and potentially underwater archaeology in the lagoon, work costing millions of dollars with no guarantee of results. Compare this to how American missing persons investigations evolve. Cold cases are periodically reviewed as new technology becomes available. DNA databases expand. Forensic techniques improve. Witnesses age and sometimes provide deathbed confessions. Cases get solved decades later because someone finds the critical piece of evidence that earlier investigators missed. But the Earhart case isn't just missing one critical piece, it's missing context. Even if someone finds wreckage tomorrow, we won't know for certain it's Earhart's without serial numbers or unique identifiers. Even if bones are discovered, DNA matching requires comparison samples from confirmed relatives, which exist, but haven't been matched to anything because no testable remains have been recovered. Every piece of potential evidence requires 3 more pieces to confirm it. The Japanese government has been notably silent on the capture theory. Official archives from the 1930s are incomplete. Many records were destroyed during World War II. In American diplomatic terms, there's no incentive for Japan to investigate claims that their military captured and possibly killed an American civilian. It's historically sensitive, politically complicated, and benefits nobody to confirm. If the capture theory is true, the proof is either destroyed or buried so deep in classified archives that it may never surface. If it's false, the absence of evidence isn't proof of absence, it's just absence. This is the investigative dead end that frustrates researchers. You can't prove something didn't happen. So we're left with an investigation that resembles 3 separate cold cases being worked simultaneously by different teams, each convinced the others are wrong, each following evidence that leads to different continents and different conclusions. TIGHAR looks at Pacific Islands. Marshall Islands researchers look at Japanese territories. Deep sea salvage companies look at ocean floors. Nobody is searching the same place. In American missing persons cases, this would be unacceptable. Lead investigators would synthesize all theories, prioritize based on probability, and focus resources on the most likely scenario. But Earhart disappeared in international waters in 1937, so there is no lead investigator. There's no central authority. There are only competing private investigations, each following their own evidence. The investigation hasn't ended because it can't end. Not without a breakthrough that eliminates 2 of the 3 theories. And that breakthrough has eluded researchers for 89 years. One question remains. Given everything we know, given all the evidence and all the gaps, what actually happened to Amelia Earhart? After 89 years, 250,000 square miles searched, millions of dollars spent, and countless theories proposed, here's what we know for certain about Amelia Earhart's disappearance: remarkably little. What is proven? Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan departed La, New Guinea, on July 2, 1937, at 10 a.m. local time, heading for Howland Island. The flight covered 2,556 miles over open ocean. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca received intermittent radio transmissions from Earhart as she approached Howland. Her final transmission, at 8:43 a.m. Howland time, stated, "We are on the line 157 to 337. No further verified contact was made. The U.S. Navy conducted a 17-day search covering approximately 250,000 square miles. No wreckage, bodies, or definitive evidence was found. Earhart and Noonan were declared lost at sea on July 19, 1937. That's it. That's the entire list of undisputed facts. What is disputed? Everything else. Whether Earhart ran out of fuel immediately or had reserves to continue flying. Whether she crashed in deep water or reached an island. Whether the post-loss radio signals were genuine or misidentified interference. Whether the bones found on Nikumaroro were hers or someone else's. Whether witnesses in the Marshall Islands saw Earhart or conflated different events across decades. Whether the 2024 sonar contact is her aircraft or just another false lead. The case remains open not because evidence is missing, but because evidence is contradictory. Every theory has supporting facts. Every theory has fatal gaps. Theory number 1. Crash and sink near Howland, most probable. Earhart ran out of fuel between 9 to 10 a.m. on July 2, ditched in the ocean within 100 miles of Howland Island, and the aircraft sank in deep water. Evidence supporting. This is what happened to most 1930s transoceanic flights that disappeared. Statistical probability alone makes it the leading theory. Earhart's final transmission gave no indication she could see land. The Itasca was receiving maximum strength signals, suggesting she was relatively close to Howland. Deep water depth near Howland, 15,000 to 18,000 feet, would make wreckage unrecoverable with 1937 technology and difficult even today. The 2024 sonar contact, if confirmed, would provide physical evidence. Problems. Doesn't explain the phantom radio signals reported for days after July 2. Doesn't explain why intensive aerial searches saw no oil slicks or debris. The sonar contact remains unconfirmed and could be geological formation. Probability, 60%. This aligns with Occam's razor and aviation accident statistics. In American crash investigation, when a plane disappears over deep water with no wreckage found, crashed and sank, is the default conclusion unless evidence suggests otherwise. Theory number 2. Nikumaroro castaway death, second most probable. Earhart flew northwest on the 157 to 337 line, reached Nikumaroro Island approximately 350 miles from Howland, landed on the reef, survived for days or weeks transmitting distress signals, and eventually died from dehydration or injury. Evidence supporting. Nikumaroro lies directly on the 157 to 337 line of position. Human bones matching Earhart's height and sex were found there in 1940. Artifacts from the 1930s, including aircraft aluminum, a sextant box, and period-appropriate items, have been recovered from the island. The USS Colorado's July 9 flyover could have missed survivors sheltering from the sun. Forensic dog alerts in 2018 suggested human remains in multiple locations. Problems. The bones were lost before DNA testing became available. None of the artifacts can be definitively linked to Earhart's specific aircraft. The island was briefly settled in the 1940s, so artifacts could have come from colonists. Fred Noonan's remains have never been found. The phantom radio signals stopped by July 13, but survival could have continued longer. Probability, 30%. This theory has more physical evidence than any other, but all of it is circumstantial. In American legal terms, it would create reasonable doubt but not prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Theory number 3. Japanese capture, least probable. Earhart flew into Japanese-controlled Marshall Islands, crashed near Mealy Atoll, was captured by Japanese military forces who suspected her of espionage, and died in Japanese custody on Saipan. Evidence supporting. Multiple Marshall Islands and Saipan witnesses reported seeing a female American prisoner in 1937. Japan had heavily militarized the islands and viewed American aircraft as potential reconnaissance. The U.S. Navy deliberately avoided searching Japanese waters. Post-war occupation forces specifically investigated Earhart rumors on Saipan, suggesting military intelligence took the possibility seriously. Problems: all witness testimony came decades after the alleged events with no physical corroboration. The 2017 photograph was debunked as predating Earhart's disappearance. No Japanese military records mention American prisoners matching Earhart's description. Post-war investigators found no grave sites, aircraft parts, or documentation. Many Japanese records were destroyed, but the complete absence of evidence is suspicious. Probability: 10%. This theory requires multiple improbable events. Navigational error taking Earhart 800+ miles off course, Japanese military capture instead of rescue, systematic destruction of all evidence, and witness memories remaining accurate for 30+ years. Possible but least likely. The American lens. What makes this case uniquely frustrating for American audiences is that it violates our expectation that mysteries get solved. In the United States, when a plane crashes, the NTSB investigates until they determine cause, even if it takes years. When someone goes missing, the case stays active indefinitely. We expect closure. But Earhart disappeared in international waters under 1937 laws that no longer exist, investigated by colonial authorities who are long dead, with evidence handled by systems that didn't prioritize preservation. The modern American investigative framework, chain of custody, forensic standards, international cooperation treaties, didn't exist yet. The case remains open because three theories are each 10 to 60% probable, and 10% isn't low enough to eliminate. In American criminal justice, we'd need proof beyond reasonable doubt, 98% certainty. This case can't even reach 61%. Your turn. After hearing the evidence, which theory do you believe? Are you convinced Earhart went straight into the ocean, making this a tragedy of fuel miscalculation and 1930s navigation? Do the Nikumaroro artifacts suggest she died as a castaway on a reef, sending distress signals nobody heard? Or do you think the Marshall Islands witnesses are telling the truth about something their governments never wanted confirmed? More importantly, does it matter? Amelia Earhart has been gone for 89 years. Everyone who knew her is dead. The search has cost millions. At what point does a mystery stop being an investigation and become mythology? Or is there still one piece of evidence out there? One sonar image that turns out to be real, one DNA match from a forgotten bone fragment, one declassified document in a Tokyo archive, that could finally answer the question, what happened on July 2, 1937, after that final radio call? Leave your theory in the comments. And if you're interested in more international cold cases explained for American audiences, subscribe to Noir Docket. Because the truth is out there, we just haven't found it yet.